in a quiet village in a part of the Western Front battlefields that it's easy to overlook. Men who had fought at Gallipoli and in some of Australia's toughest battles on the Western Front took part in their final attack of the Great War. This was Montbrehain, the last Digger action. Tomorrow is the 25th of April, Anzac Day, the day when, in 1915, the men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps landed on the beaches at Gallipoli. The Australians and New Zealanders weren't the only ones at Gallipoli, of course. More French died at Gallipoli than Australians, but for those young nations, those young Dominion nations, this was a moment in time, a moment in their history when, as those young nations, they entered the world stage. So it became a defining moment for nations like Australia in the Great War. And we see this with many of those nations on different battlefields of the First World War. And while Gallipoli came to dominate the Australian consciousness of the First World War, it was the war on the Western Fronts and Australia's casualties on the Western Front that would really dominate the experience of Australian troops in that conflict. So to commemorate Anzac Day, we'll not look at Gallipoli, we'll go right to the end of Australia's experience on the Western Front and look at the final engagement of men from the Imperial Force as part of the Australian Corps in the last Digger action of the First World War, Australia's last pitched battle of the war on the Western Front, the attack on the small village of Montbrehain. But before we do that, let's look at how Australia got to that point in October 1918 when the attack on Montbrehain was made. After Gallipoli, Australian troops went to Egypt. The size of the Australian Imperial Force was growing, and now there were more battalions and more divisions, but they were not brought together under a unified Australian command at this time. They were going to be attached to different parts of the British Expeditionary Force on the Western Front. That was their next destination, to head via Marseille to France, up onto the Western Fronts and take part in operations there. And in 1916, Australian troops found themselves going over the top, first at Fromelles, their first major battle on the Western Fronts in the Great War. One of the most costliest Australian engagements of that conflict, indeed of any conflict. And then just a few days later, Australian troops were attacking around the village of Pozières and close to Mouquet Farm in the operations as part of the Battle of the Somme. By the end of 1916, there were now 5 Australian divisions on the Western Front, and they endured that terrible winter of 1916-17, often referred to as the coldest winter of the war, with sub-zero temperatures in the front line area, before in 1917 taking part in the advance to the Hindenburg Line as the Germans withdrew from the Somme area into their pre-prepared positions, and then taking part in the fighting at Bullecourt, which we featured in a previous episode of the podcast. 1917 would also see Australian troops taking part in the Battle of Messines in June, and then the third Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Passchendaele, in the fighting at Polygon Wood and on the Bruinzinde Ridge. So by the end of 1917, the Australians had really made their mark on the battles of the Western Front. Australians had taken part in terrible, costly disasters like Fromelles, but they'd also taken part in operations such as the attack on the Bruinzinde Ridge, which had been hugely successful. But all this fighting had cost them dearly in terms of casualties, men killed, wounded, and going sick. And by the spring of 1918, the Australian divisions were holding some of the quiet sectors of the Western Front, just as the Germans made their attack on the Somme with the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, on the 21st of March, and then in the attack in Flanders in April. And during that period, Australian troops found themselves being brought down from these quiet sectors, being units that were up to pretty high levels of strength in terms of numbers of men, and they found themselves being pitched into the fighting to stop that German advance, particularly on the Somme. And in fighting around Villers-Bretonneux in March and April of 1918, the Australians were able to stop the Germans from reaching Amiens, reaching that key railhead, at a point which you could call a decisive moment of the war on the Western Front, because if that railhead, if that area around Amiens had fallen, then the whole logistics effort of the British Army to sustain itself could have been under threat. So, not quite as a reward for it, but as really as a recognition of the contribution of Australian troops, That period in which the Australians had contributed so greatly in the spring of 1918 was the moment in which a decision was made to bring those 5 Australian divisions together into an Australian corps commanded by an Australian general, John Monash, and they would now be their own entity. Now, as an army corps, they were still part of a bigger formation, one of the 5 armies on the Western Front, and then part of the bigger British Expeditionary Force. But this gave them a degree of autonomy that they perhaps hadn't enjoyed, being separate divisions moved around the different corps, British corps on different points on the Western Front. So for Australia's military history in the battles of the Great War, this was an important moment. And having taken command of the Australian Corps, Monash wasted no time in demonstrating what his view of warfare was all about. Now, he was not unique in this view of warfare. It was part of the way in which the whole BEF, the whole British Expeditionary Force, was learning how to fight its battles. But if we begin to look at an Australian timeline of 1918 that leads us up to Montbrehain, it begins on the 4th of July with the attack at Le Hamel, when Australian troops captured a whole area of ground using new approaches to fighting, a greater combination of infantry, artillery and tanks, aircraft in the air, resupply of some positions by flying aircraft and dropping ammunition onto objectives so when the men got there they had ammo to defend that against counter-attacks. All of this was part of a general progression, but Monash and his command and the Australians on the ground at Le Hamel proved what could be done given the right circumstances, and this would go on to become standard operational procedure for the whole BEF as the year 1918 moved forward, as we moved towards the big battles that brought about the end of the conflict. And the next of those that involved Australian troops in this area was on the 8th of August 1918 with the Battle of Amiens, the Black Day of the German army, when British, Australian, Canadian and on their flank French troops broke through the German fronts in a wide area and pushed deep into the German positions, bringing about the beginning of the end of the war. This was the beginning of the last 100 days of the First World War, and Australian troops were part of the tip of the spear of this, breaking through the German lines beyond Villers-Bretonneux and Le Hamel, moving out towards places like Proyart and Lyon and down into the Somme River Valley in the approach to Péronne. By the 1st of September 1918, they're in action at Mont-Saint-Quentin, just outside the town of Péronne, when it's a successful operation and the German position there is captured. But one of the Australian brigades, the 6th Australian Brigade, which comprised 4 infantry battalions of the Australian Imperial Force, went into action just over 1,300 men strong. Now, when you think that a typical battalion on paper is just over 1,000 strong, and there's 4 of them in a brigade, this brigade could only muster 1,300 men, then it shows that they're struggling to keep the manpower going. And this was one of the great problems for the Australian Imperial Force and the whole Australian Corps as 1918 moves forward, because this was a volunteer army. There was no conscription in Australia. They voted on it twice and rejected it. So every man was a volunteer, whereas by this stage of the conflict, Britain, Canada and eventually New Zealand would all be conscripting soldiers to replace the losses that it had. Australia continued to rely on volunteers, which by 1918, understandably, were beginning to dry up. So the ability to replace the losses impacted on the Australian Corps' ability to put men boots on the ground in these battles of the next few months of 1918. But the fight continued. After the Battle of Mont-Saint-Quentin, Péronne was taken. They set up a headquarters in the ruins of the town hall in the main square of Péronne, and some Australians renamed the street that ran alongside it Rue de Kanga, which was obviously a play on kangaroo and the French word for street, rue, R-U-E, but in this case spelt R-O-O. And on the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Péronne, the mayor of that town officially renamed that street Rue de Kanga, and when you drive through it now, you'll see Rue de Kanga proudly displayed on a blue French street sign as you go past the rebuilt town hall in the main thoroughfare of Péronne. Just a few days after the capture of this town, the Australians were in action on the Hindenburg outpost line. This was ground that had been captured in the battles of 1917, lost in the spring of 1918, and was now being fought over again. And they were moving increasingly beyond static trench warfare. There were still trenches here, the Germans were occupying trenches, but when you look at the photography of this period, you see how it depicts men fighting in the open, fighting what looks like modern battles, because essentially they are much more akin to operations in Normandy or Northwest Europe in 1944-45 than the sort of operations that we'd always connect to our perception of the First World War. Trench warfare, barbed wire, no man's land, crater zones. This was a different type of war the Australians and indeed the whole BEF were taking part in at this time. A few days later, again, the Australians were in action at Vermand. They lost nearly 1,400 casualties in an operation here. They captured over 4,300 German prisoners. But again, all of these casualties and the lack of replacements meant that the Australian Corps was beginning to creak at the seams a bit in terms of its operational capabilities on the battlefield. There was talk of rest, there was talk of sending Australians home to Australia. The ones who'd been there since the very beginning for some periods of rest at home to see their family. But the fighting continued, and Monash found himself committing more and more men to more and more operations. So why was Australia so very much at the tip of that spear in these battles of 1918? Well, they did have a good fighting reputation. When we read Bean, we see this perception of being 6-foot bronzed bushmen. The reality was it was very different. Most Australians lived in towns or in urban areas at the time of the First World War. But there was just this sense amongst Australians that coming from a nation like Australia, that they were somehow different. And you see that reflected in the way that they fight. But also there is a technical reason why Australians and indeed Canadians are used so extensively in this period, is because the British Army had reorganised itself. An infantry division made up of 12 fighting battalions in the British Army had been reduced to 9 because of the lack of reinforcements during the winter of 1917-18. But the Australian divisions and the Canadian divisions and the New Zealand division all retained their 12 infantry battalions. So on paper, from a command point of view, they looked very attractive formations to put in the forefront of your advance, because on paper they were stronger, they had more battalions, and they could achieve more in the ground that was given to them. But of course, any battle, victorious battles, they still result in losses. Canadians are able to replace those losses because of conscription, but the Australians cannot. So like I say, by September, like late September of 1918, the Australian Corps is beginning to creak quite seriously at the seams, to a point where men actually refused to go back to the front to take part in operations. There were 119 men from the 1st Battalion AIF, for example, who refused to go back. Now, there's no death penalty for this in the Australian forces. There was a decision made quite early on that they would not hand over the power of capital courts martial to the British Expeditionary Force and the high command of that. So these men could not be shot for refusing to go back to the fight, but they were convicted of desertion and sentenced to 10 years in prison. That was eventually commuted post-war. But there was a discipline issue. I think at one point something like 16,000 Australian soldiers were in some form of military prison behind the Western Front or in Britain. And there were senior Australian military commanders, Pompey Elliott being one of them, that were calling for the introduction of the death sentence to create a deterrent for men not to desert and not to quit their posts, and all sorts of other discipline issues. So it's a complex subject, and it wasn't that these men didn't want to fight or were not committed to the cause potentially. They felt that they'd done their bit, that they'd been slogging away as volunteers, and it was time that some other fella come along and did his bit. And you can understand this. It was a war weariness. It was a degree of fatigue, and we'll talk about that again shortly. But the fighting continued. On the 27th of September, there was another attack on the main Hindenburg line near Bonny and Bellicourt, when Australian troops fought alongside men from the American Expeditionary Force in the 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee divisions. And having broken through that area, the fighting then continued towards Le Catelet, and the final section of this area of the Hindenburg Line, the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line. And in those operations, from the breakthrough at Bellicourt and at Bonny alongside the Americans through to the advance towards the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line, the Australians had suffered yet more casualties, nearly 4,000 men killed, wounded and missing. And really now they had hit crisis point. So we've reached this point really where fatigue is beginning to completely engulf the Australian Corps. On paper, there were 57 infantry battalions in the Australian Imperial Force as part of this corps. But at this point, they were over 8,500 men short. There were only 3,000 replacements due in the next few weeks or months. These were men, either new enlistments who had joined up in Australia, done their training and been posted to Britain prior to arriving on the Western Front, or they were men who'd been wounded in previous operations, recovered from those wounds and were coming back. And if you just do the maths, 3,000 is not going to make up for a shortfall of 8,500 men. So what that had meant is that in these operations that we've talked about, from beyond the Hamel through to the battles again on the Hindenburg Line, many battalions, which on paper would be over 1,000 men strong, were actually going into action with 350 men. In some of the engagements, when you read Bean and look at some of the war diaries, you see that some battalions were down to 150 men, which is less than the size of an infantry company. And although the Australians had this incredible fighting reputation, a battalion of 150 men is not going to be able to achieve the same level of battlefield success as a full-strength infantry battalion, because it will suffer losses, and if the Germans attack in strength, it just will not be able to retain the positions it's captured. And when you look at the story of some individual battalions within the Australian Corps, you see some staggering levels of casualties in their operations on the Western Front. The 25th Battalion AIF, for example, lost from its arrival on the Western Front in 1916 until the end of the war 133 officers and 3,339 men. Of that figure, over 1,000 were killed in action or died of wounds. Now, in the infantry, normally about 1 in 5 were killed and 3 in 5 were wounded. So this level of casualties is much higher than normal, and it shows how heavily involved these Australian battalions had been in some of the key battles of the Great War. And what this led to was the disbandment of some battalions. With this manpower crisis, you could not sustain these 57 infantry battalions. So a decision was made to, just as the British had done, was to disband battalions. Now this caused problems because men were proud, being volunteers, they were proud of the units in which they served. They had shed blood for these units. They had seen men die alongside them for these units. They'd captured ground. They'd held it. They'd shown what their battalion, what Australia was capable of doing. And they did not want to give up on that heritage. So men were very resistant to the idea, having great pride in these units, of seeing them suddenly disappear. And indeed, that 25th Battalion that had suffered all those casualties was one of those that was selected to be disbanded. And what this led to was what the Australians called jack-ups, which to a degree have been romanticised. The Anzac series that was on the television in the 1980s did this to an extent. But essentially these men went on strike. They refused orders because they refused to disband their units. But this led to highly respected senior officers, again like Pompey Elliott, coming in, who stepped in and persuaded the men that this was the right thing to do. If Australia was going to continue to be a part of these operations on the Western Front, then this was a necessity. So men reluctantly began to disband and be transferred to other units. But some battalions, like the 37th and the 60th Battalions Australian Imperial Force, did go on these strikes, and what they said was, we're not refusing to fight, send us back, it'll be do or die. We'll show what these battalions can do, and you'll either have to disband us as a consequence of it, or there'll be none of us left, and that'll be the end of the story anyway. So as late September moves into early October, it's clear that as a coherent fighting force, the Australian position on the Western Front is in jeopardy. It needs a rest. It needs a time to pause, to regroup, to replace losses, and then it can be committed to the fight again. But many felt perhaps was their war over. But as with any aspect of being a soldier, nothing was really that sure, and the Western Front was not quite done with the Australian Imperial Force just yet. The village of Montbrehain sits on part of what was known as the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line, this last major section of the Hindenburg Line. 5,000 yards of this Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line had been captured by early October 1918. Beyond it was open ground, and once you were through this, trench warfare was essentially over. It was going to be open warfare through villages, across fields, through copses and woods, along canals and up into towns and eventually cities like Mons. But that was yet to come. Here, they still had to break through this final line of defence in this part of the Western Front. And this area had seen men from the 46th North Midland Division. So these were Midland Territorials, men from the North and South Staffordshire Regiment, the Sherwood Foresters, the Leicesters. They'd all taken part in the battle along the St Quentin Canal, and the Staffordshire Brigade had taken the Rickervale Bridge along the St Quentin Canal, resulting in that famous photograph of the men on the bank there with their brigadier, the Tally-Ho VC, Brigadier Campbell, looking down at the men, congratulating them for their victory there. They'd continued with the fight beyond that up towards this part of the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line, and having taken the area around Montbrehain, there'd been a plan to implement British cavalry to capture the village. Now, at this stage of the war, cavalry had come back into play. We tend to think of cavalry being completely redundant in the conflict, and we look at battles like the Somme and Arras, where cavalry had been used disastrously, resulting in heavy losses, particularly at Arras in the attack on Monchy-le-Preux. But when the war went mobile again, cavalry had their value, and cavalry were increasingly used in these final battles in their purpose to go forward as reconnaissance troops to see where the Germans had moved back to or what they were defending, and also to rapidly move men forward to capture a position, because the cavalry could use their horses to get to a location. Cavalry soldiers had Lee-Enfield rifles, so could dismount, dig in and hold an objective until the main force of infantry arrived and they could remount, gallop off and go somewhere else. So this use of what was essentially rapid forces was an important part of these final battles on the Western Front. But here the cavalry had not been able to take Montbrehain, and a British attack on the 4th of October 1918 had taken the ground to the north of Montbrehain village, but the village and the surrounding countryside were still in German hands. Now, it's only a small village, and it sits on some rising ground. Many of these positions of the Hindenburg Line were deliberately sited, so they were the best possible positions to defend from, and this was no exception. It's very much like the Somme battlefields here. We're not in the Somme department, we're just outside it in the department of the Aisne here. But this is rolling chalk downland with big, vast, open fields. Today, just as it was in 1918. And in fact, when you come to these battlefields of that final phase of the war, very little has changed. There's a few wind farms here now, but generally the landscape is pretty much identical to what it was. And if you come here in the late summer and early autumn of a year, you're looking at the ground pretty much as it was when the men took part in the attacks on places like Montbrehain. So it gives you a good insight into what it was like at that time over 100 years ago. So by that first week in October of 1918, a village like Montbrehain, one of several in this area, needed to be taken to break this last line of defence so the men could push on beyond into this open ground, onwards towards the next town, Le Cateau, which had been the scene of fighting right at the beginning of the war in August 1914. Troops were needed for the task, and Monash had available to him the 21st, the 24th and the 2nd Pioneer Battalion from the 2nd Australian Division available to be committed to an attack on this part of the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line. And his decision to commit these troops was made despite an agreement to rest shattered Australian troops and move them away from the battlefield, not commit them again to another attack. But commit them he did. So having looked at the backgrounds to this point, to where the attack on Montbrehain began on the 5th of October 1918, let's begin our battlefield walk on the ground where it all took place. We're beginning our walk on the D713, which is the road from Joncourt to Ramicourt. Joncourt was where Wilfred Owen was fighting in October 1918, near to a position known as Swiss Cottage, which is just behind us. He captured a German machine gun position, for which he was subsequently awarded the Military Cross. And his unit, having captured that part of the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line, other British units then moved forward and passed through that area towards the next village that lies ahead of us, which is the village of Ramicourt. To the north of this road is the village of Villancourt, and to the south Sequoia, and there, close to a position known as Mannequin Hill, the 1st 6th North Staffordshire Regiment made an attack there in the lead-up to the assault on Montbrehain, and Bill Coltman of that battalion, stretcher-bearer, would be awarded a Victoria Cross for his bravery and add that medal to the DCM, the Distinguished Conduct Medal, and the Military Medal, which he'd already been awarded for previous engagements of his battalion in going out and picking up the wounded. An amazing character, which we'll return to his story in another podcast another day. But we'll continue along the D713 towards Ramicourt, and it goes round a couple of bends, and just on the outskirts of the village there's a track that goes off to the left that takes you out into the fields north of the village and close to the neighbouring village of Villancourt. And you get to a junction of several tracks joining together at one point. And here we'll stop because we're in the area where the 24th Battalion, Australian Imperial Force, made its attack towards Montbrehain. And standing here we can see the church spire of Montbrehain in the distance, the top of the grain silo that's near to the village. And the 24th Battalion that was here was only about 240 men strong for this assault, according to Bean. It was led by Lieutenant Colonel William James, DSO. He was, like many of the men involved in this battle, a Gallipoli veteran, so he's an original Anzac, wearing the little brass A on his colour patch on the upper sleeve of his tunic that indicated that he'd served at Gallipoli. This is something you see at this stage of the war, proudly displayed by the Gallipoli, the Anzac veterans. So Lieutenant Colonel James was an experienced soldier. He'd been awarded the Distinguished Service Order for bravery at Ypres before the war. He'd been a farmer, and he came from Harcourt in Victoria. He was leading a battalion that did, of course, have some new men in it, but a lot of men that had seen experience from Gallipoli right through the battles of the Western Front, had been wounded like Lieutenant Colonel James had in the fighting on the Hindenburg line. And on his right flank, that area was secured by two friends, Captain John Harry Fletcher, who was a school teacher, and Captain John Mahoney, who was, according to Bean, a famous footballer. Both, like James, were Gallipoli men. They'd known each other before the war. They'd served at Gallipoli, and during the cold winter of 1916-17, they'd set up football matches for the Australian troops when out of the line in the village of Warloy-Ballon on the Somme. And whenever I travel through that village, there is a football field there now, a modern one for the people of the village. But I always think of Fletcher and Mahoney and the diggers who were there during that time, getting warm by running around the fields, kicking a football around, having a bit of footy. So this was a battalion, the 24th, like many of them at this stage of the war, made up not just of men who'd seen a lot of combat, but who knew each other and were bound together in that friendship that the fighting on these battlefields had produced, really. Having walked up to this junction of tracks, we'll go off effectively to our right towards the village of Montbrehain itself and follow the track across the fields through another junction of tracks where there's a little bit of a sunken area with some trees, and then we'll follow it round towards the village itself. And in doing so, we are following the assault of the 24th Battalion on that morning of the 5th of October 1918, when they advanced through this route across this ground in the early morning mist, which gave them a degree of protection as they moved towards the edge of the village. Just as we'll do now, the track goes off to the left and takes you up onto the the road that comes down into Montbrehain itself. Here we'll stop and look down into the village, because it was in this area that the 24th Battalion met quite stiff opposition as the Germans defended the outskirts of the village itself. And there was fighting here, not really amongst trenches. When you look at the photographs of Montbrehain, the Germans were using some of the ditches by the side of the road, or very improvised trench positions. And there was fighting in the hedgerow here, in the lane, and eventually in the houses. In this action, Lieutenant George Ingram, MM, of the 24th, led his platoon into one of the positions close to where we are now, which had 9 machine guns in it, and he captured over 40 Germans alongside these machine guns which he'd silenced. This effectively ended the German opposition on this part of the battlefield, and he took control of the survivors of the 24th in his area when all of the other officers around him were killed or wounded. Ingham, long-serving soldier like the others, military medal, so he's come up through the ranks. He became the last Australian soldier to be awarded the Victoria Cross on the Western Front in the Great War. So he was the last Australian VC of World War I, and that action took place close to where we're standing now on the outskirts of Montbrehain. So it wasn't just the last digger action of the war, it was the last digger VC action of the war as well. From here, rather than go straight into the village, we'll just retrace our steps back down the lane again to that second junction of tracks near the bit where the trees were along the embankment, taking it south back down onto the D713 on the eastern outskirts of Ramicourt, and we've now moved into the area where the 21st and the 2nd Pioneer Battalion made their attack on the village. We're now standing close to the grain silo, which is one of the features on this part of the battlefield, and we're looking across and into the village of Montbrehain itself. The 21st Battalion, who made their attack close to where we're standing now, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Duggan, DSO. He was a 31-year-old farmer, just like James, also from Victoria. Again, Duggan is a Gallipoli veteran. He'd served on the Somme, been awarded the Distinguished Service Order for bravery there in 1916. And like the 24th Battalion, the 21st who attacked here was also around about 240 men strong. In their advance, they also encountered a lot of German machine guns, and the ground over which they're advancing is pretty open, and these machine guns potentially could lay down a lot of fire, but they overran them and captured the position. Again, when we look at the photographic evidence for this battle, and there's not as many photographs of Montbrehain as there are for some of the other Australian actions in 1918, and I'll put a selection of them on the Old Frontline podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, along with some modern images of the battlefield. But when we look at these photographs, we see that, yeah, sure, the standard German Maxim MG08 is their heavy machine gun, but also increasingly at this stage of the war, the Germans are using more and more of the MG08-15s, and these were their answer to the Lewis gun. So it's still a water-cooled weapon, which was probably one of its disadvantages. And by this stage, it had a drum magazine that could be fitted on the side with the rounds in it for the machine gun to be fired. It was quite a portable machine gun, and more of these were being used by the Germans to defend positions like this. And a whole combination of them could lay down a fearsome amount of firepower into an area, holding up any type of infantry attack without its own support. But equally, on the Australian, indeed on the British side of no man's land at this stage of the conflict, we were seeing an increased number of Lewis machine guns being used. So the automatic firepower at this stage of the fight on the Western Front was increased dramatically to assist in the suppression of positions with automatic fire so that men can advance, and conversely from the German point of view, laying down fire into an area, depriving it of the enemy and stopping them from advancing any further. So the use of automatic weapons, machine guns in this stage of the fight on the Western Front was a key element of the battles, and they play more and more of an important role, particularly the so-called light machine guns like the MG08-15 and the Lewis gun. We're also close to where the 2nd Australian Pioneer Battalion went into action. Now, this was the first occasion in Australia's experience on the Western Front in which a Pioneer Battalion had been used as a standard infantry assault battalion in an attack. Every division, whether it's Australian, Canadian or British, had a Pioneer Battalion, and it was there to serve, yes, occasionally as infantry, but its major task was battlefield pioneer work and engineering work to assist in attacks, carrying Bangalore torpedoes through, assisting with getting through the wire, putting up wire, helping to turn a trench round when you captured it, so reversing the parados and the parapet, so you could then defend it against enemy attacks, and a whole multitude of other tasks as well. But to be used as straightforward infantry, as the 2nd Australian Pioneer Battalion was here on the 5th of October 1918, was an unusual aspect of this battle. But it also demonstrates, I suppose, just how desperate the Australian Corps was getting for fighting troops, that it's beginning to use pioneers as infantry in an attack like this. So that goes back to what we were saying about the whole wider issue with manpower in the Australian Army at this stage of 1918. But this was a successful attack, and as we walk down the D713 into the outskirts of Montbrehain, we're following the direction of that attack in October 1918. And despite their relatively low numbers, they were probably up against greatly depleted German forces as well, which possibly is also highlighted even further by the amount of machine guns, automatic weapons that they were using to defend the position, to make up for their lack of rifle platoons and their boots on the ground, their strength in defending the village of Montbrehain. But it was a successful attack, and the village was captured on the 5th of October. We'll come down into the outskirts of it now. One of the things about villages in this area of the Western Front battlefields is that generally they only saw combat at the two ends of the war. So there was a little bit of fighting as the British Army withdrew through here during the retreat from Mons in August 1914. I don't believe that any action took place in Montbrehain itself at that time, but it wasn't far away at Le Cateau. This then remained behind the German lines for much of the next 4 years, and then there was the attack here in October 1918. So what that means is when we come into a village like this, we see a lot of original buildings, and quite a lot of those buildings as well show battle damage from the fighting here in 1918. So we can see some visible evidence of this final action involving Australian troops. So while if we went just a few miles down the road to the ground around Cambrai or back towards the Somme, we're in the devastated zone of France, completely destroyed by the First World War. Here we've got buildings going back to the 17th and 18th century and possibly even before that, but showing, as I say, those marks of the combat here in those final weeks of the Great War. So we'll turn off at Rue Neuve, go up past the church, we'll see that up on our left, go up to a junction of roads and we'll take the Rue du Cimetière off to our left, and that'll take us up to a military cemetery on the outskirts of the village, and that'll be our next stop. This is Calvary Cemetery. It's one of two small battlefield cemeteries at Montbrehain in which the dead of the Australian Imperial Force who fell here in October 1918 are buried. There were some other isolated burial sites as well that were moved to places like Bellicourt after the war, and the wounded who were hit here and evacuated back down the evacuation chain, quite a few of those are at Tincourt British Cemetery near Peronne, which was a casualty clearing station at that time. But this is one that I come to every time I visit Montbrehain. Like I say, a small battlefield cemetery. There's 48 Australians buried in here, alongside 23 British, and all the burials date from either September or October of 1918. The ones from September are possibly men who were wounded in the advance on the Hindenburg Line and captured by the Germans to be treated in their medical facilities here in Montbrehain and died of their wounds and were buried in a military plots. The main civilian cemetery was close by, and it's quite possible that once there were German graves. In quite a lot of these villages in this area, there once were German cemeteries that were subsequently closed and moved into larger ones. Massomé, who is not far from here, is just down the road near Saint-Quentin, St. Quentin. Of those 70-odd burials here, 16 are unidentified, so the majority are known, and there's quite a few Australians who were killed in the fighting for Montbrehain. One of those buried here is Captain John Harry Fletcher. He was one of that pair of friends that was on the flank of the 24th Battalion as they moved towards the village. Him and his pal Mahoney did not survive this last digger action. John was killed here, and Mahoney was wounded in the action and died of wounds at Tincourt, the location I mentioned previously where the casualty clearing station was. So these two old pals who'd spent so long together at Gallipoli and on the Western Front, this was where their war came to an end. And they're typical of the casualties that were suffered in this battle. When we look round this cemetery, there is a huge amount of experience from the shores of the Dardanelles through to the trenches of the Somme and the Hindenburg Line and in Flanders. And when we stand here and we look at the graves of men like Fletcher, we're looking at men that really epitomise the whole fighting spirit of Australian soldiers in the Great War. When I bring English groups here and explain, just how important the Australian contribution was to the fight on the Western Front, over 45,000 Australian soldiers lost their lives in the fighting in France and Flanders from 1916 until the end of the war. And they had this reputation at the time as tough fighting troops. And how much of that was real, how much of it was imagined, how much of it has become Anzac-y in those recent years when the Australian contribution to the First World War has come back into sharp focus. But this is not an imagined reputation. If you look at the deeds of these men and the things that they'd done, it's quite clear that they were capable of achieving sometimes what seemed almost impossible. And during this period of lockdown in the last 12 months, many of us will have gone back to books that we love and read things that we haven't read for a while. And outside of my reading on the Great War, I do like Bernard Cornwell's sharp novels about the Peninsular War, and indeed before the Peninsula and right up to Waterloo. But there's an occasion in one of those books where Sharp's regiment is about to attack the town of Badajoz and besiege its walls. And Sharp gets into an argument with one of the officers and gets accused of being a pirate swanning around. And it always makes me think of the Australians, this reputation they had. It was a similar sort of thing, as if they were a bunch of pirates fighting their own war, men like Jacker with Jacker's mob and so on. And Sharp says to this officer, he says, when we get up those walls at Badajoz, you'll need pirates like us. And I think to me that sums up what these men were about. These were that tip of the spear in this final battle on the Western Front. The Australians alongside the Canadians, the involvement of New Zealand troops, and of course many divisions of the British Army. But you see these men being used time and time again in these last 100 days of the war. And as victorious as those deeds were, they are paved with the graves of men like Captain Fletcher and his pal Mahoney. Victory can never be achieved without loss, without casualties. And these men were the cost of those victories for Australia in that final phase of the First World War. So what was the significance of this battle here at Montbrehain? It was one of the smallest battles that the Australians fought, but also, of course, their last, so it takes on a significance for that. Because after this battle, the Australian Corps was no longer in a position to continue to fight even small-scale actions like the one they fought here at Montbrehain. It needed to go out on rest. It needed to build up its strength again, get in those reinforcements. When it would be ready to be committed to battle again, it was difficult to say at this time. So that lack of the introduction of conscription in this final month of the First World War relegated Australian troops to the sidelines, and only a handful of Australians were killed on the battlefields in the following weeks leading up to the 11th of November. Men who were part of the Royal Air Force flying in the skies above the battlefields of the Western Front. And on the 4th of November 1918, in the attack on the Montbrehain Canal, some men from the Australian tunnelling companies, the mining and boring companies, took part in the assaults on Lock Number 1 alongside men from the Royal Sussex Regiment carrying push-pipe mines to push through the German wire that protected the positions over which they were assaulting in that attack. And there's a little group of them together in a tiny cemetery at Reget de Beaulieu, where those are probably the last Australians to be killed in action on the Western Front in the Great War. But while their action took place on the 4th of November, at that stage, a month nearly after Montbrehain, still the bulk of the Australian Corps were out on rest. Men had been sent back to Australia to go and see their families, were in Britain on leave there, and they were still in this process of rebuilding. So if the war had gone on into 1919, which many at this stage did speculate would happen, Probably the Australians would have returned for the final offensive then, but that great achievement from Le Hamel through to Amiens, through to the Hindenburg Line, right up to Montbrehain, had cost them so dearly that, in the words of one Australian veteran, they had to sit it out for the last knock-ins. So in some ways, probably Montbrehain would have just been a footnote in the history of the Australian Imperial Force in the Great War. But it was an ending, and in nearly 2.5 years on the Western Front, Australia had found its own path through the trenches and the barbed wire and the mud of no man's land. Some 45,000 diggers lay dead across so many battlefields, from Fromelles to Mucky Farm, from the killing ground of Bullecourt to the swamps and the shell-smashed ground of Third Ypres, and on to the open fields of those battlefields of 1918. Those graves and the echoes of their deeds forever secured immortality for the slouch-hatted infantry from the other side of the world, a guarantee that their name would live forevermore along Australia's part of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.